All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I know many of us saw each other about 48 hours ago, so we are back at it again here on a Wednesday evening. Hope your week is going well. What we are going to plan on doing tonight, and I alluded to this on Monday, is that we're going to make a slight change. And so we are still going to talk about human relations and human resource management schools tonight as part of our discussion of the neoclassical schools of organization theory. And we'll do that in the first half of our class tonight. Then we'll take our customary evening break. And then after that evening break, when we come back, we'll then look at motivation. I know in the syllabus, motivation is showing for next week's class, but I would like to do it this week for a couple of reasons. One reason is that motivation just really dovetails so well with human resource management theory because a lot of our motivational theorists have overlap with human resource management theory, and motivation really is kind of that part and parcel of human resource management. And that if we're treating people as individuals and we're paying attention to those individual wants, needs, and desires, then that naturally leads into motivation. So, also, the second reason why I'd like to do motivation tonight is to just make sure that we have ample time once we get to our last two sessions to have plenty of time to do our presentations. And again, we are a large cohort, which is obviously very good, but it also means that we want to make sure that we allot enough time to get through all of our presentations before we are done. So, first half of class will be human relations, human resource management, then a break, and then after the break, we will do motivational theories. And I'll alert you if you've taken a look at the slides, don't have to already look at the slides, but if you've taken a look at the slides for motivational theory, you'll recognize that this information we're going to talk about in the second part of class tonight on motivation is information that is not necessarily from the Tompkins textbook. Now, certainly Tompkins does look at motivational strategies in terms of each one of the theories and schools of thought that we talk about. But the content and process-based motivational theories, what we're going to discuss in the second half of class tonight, go beyond just what's in Tompkins. And so this is information that's above and beyond what you would see in the Tompkins textbook. So just to alert you to that, but that will be for our second half of class tonight. Then also a quick reminder for Canvas essay number 2. That is coming due on the 22nd, which is next Monday. So again, for that one, what you're going to be doing is comparing public and private sector organizations and their similarities and their differences. And also, please do remember that you're going to be posting an initial response to my prompt, and then you'll also be posting responses to at least two of your classmates. So it's important to remember you're going to have a total of 3 posts that you'll be doing for each one of these Canvas essays, an initial post and then response to two classmates. And that's important from a points perspective because the Canvas essays are worth 25 points. 15 of those points will be attributable to your initial response to my prompt, and then 5 points for each of your responses to classmates. To get the full 25 points, you'll have to have all 3 of your posts for the week. So remember, that's Canvas essay 2, and that's coming due then on the 22nd. Any questions or anything before we get started moving away from the classical school and moving into some of these, what we refer to as our neoclassical schools of organization theory? All right. Then I apologize. My voice is going to be probably a little bit hoarse tonight because we had class on Monday and then I had a summer session class last night, which was a full 3.5 hour class. And so I've been talking a lot over the past 3 days. And so if my voice starts to give out on me, I apologize for that. But hopefully it will hold out long enough for us to get through our information. So last week was classical organization theory. Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, Luther Gulick, Henri Fail, Mooney, all these classical theorists. And we said that the unifying theme, or the unifying themes plural, that came out of these classical theories were number one, all these theorists were really focusing on the one size fits all approach, that there can be a universal approach that once we discover it, we can then apply it to all of our organizations to make our organizations effective and efficient. Second unifying theme that we saw is that it was very much of a macro level focus, focusing primarily on what's good for the organization without paying much attention to what is good for our individual employees. And so those are two of the unifying themes that we identified last week in the classical school. Despite those unifying themes, we also then pointed out some of the major differences. I guess that was on Monday night. Some of the major differences between these classical theorists. We said that Max Weber was focused primarily on organization structure and the ideal way to structure an organization. We said Frederick Taylor was focused on work processes and the one best way to do a job and identifying that through time motion studies and his scientific management approach. And then we said our more principles-oriented authors like Fail, Moody, and Gulick were looking for this universal set of principles that could be developed and then could be applied to our organizations to serve kind of as this managerial toolkit that our managers could use to efficiently and effectively manage their organizations. So we have some unifying themes, but then we also have some differences between our different classical organization theorists. But the one theme I really do want to pick up on is this whole idea of dehumanizing employees. And that was one of the primary critiques of the classical theories that really served as the launching pad for the development of what we call our neoclassical schools. And our neoclassical schools are essentially just the schools that came after the classical school, that were developed as responses to these criticisms associated with the classical theorists. So, in these neoclassical schools, we're going to talk in the first half of class primarily about human relations theory as well as human resource management theory. And I am relatively confident that you were exposed to some of these theories in your PPA 500 course. What we are going to do is we're going to add some additional authors and we are going to really drill down into these theories and give you a lot of background to understand why these theorists developed the theories that they did and the applicability of these theories to our modern day organizations. So, as I said, these neoclassical schools, such as human relations and human resource management, they really grew up based upon the identification of these flaws with especially scientific management. Scientific management, as we said, dehumanizing. Taylor referred to employees as being boorish beasts. He referred to them as being cogs in the machinery. So if a cog is broken, you take it out and replace it with a new one. So people were just merely replaceable parts in the machinery of the organization. Not a great deal of attention paid to individual employees as human beings. And that's the primary flaw that then served as the starting point for the development of these neoclassical theories. The person I always like to start with is Mary Parker Follett. And you'll notice in your readings in Tompkins, Tompkins refers to Follett as a pre-human relations theorist. And the reason why he does that is chronologically. So Mary Parker Follett was actually doing her work and developing her theories before the human relations theorists began. So well before Elton Mayo and well before Fritz Roethlisberger, we had Mary Parker Follett. And from a chronological perspective, Mary Parker Follett was doing a lot of her writing and developing a lot of her theories in the early 1900s at the same point in time as Frederick Taylor has developed scientific management, and scientific management was being adopted across the private and the public sector. So Mary Parker Follett is one of my favorite organization theorists because she's one of the people who had the courage to stand up and take issue with scientific management when no one else was taking issue with it. When everyone else was adopting it, she was telling us to slow down, that there are problems and flaws with scientific management. So I do appreciate the fact that she was a pioneer. She was kind of like this lone voice in the wilderness, as I like to refer to her. Unfortunately for Mary Parker Follett, when she's developing her theories in the 19 teens and the 1920s, she's developing theories as a female theorist. And so a lot of the male counterparts and contemporaries at that point in time weren't really paying attention to what Mary Parker Follett was saying. Her writings really didn't gain great acclaim until decades later. And so another reason why Tompkins refers to her as a pre-human relations theorist is not just because she came before the other human relations theorists, but there is very little evidence that those other human relations theorists who came out long later really based their theories on Mary Parker Follett. Now, they developed some theories that were similar to Mary Parker Follett, but they didn't necessarily use Mary Parker Follett as the basis for their theories. And so that's why she's considered this pre-human relations theorist. So she's a nice bridge for us between classical organization theory and this first neoclassical school known as human relations. So another reason why I like Mary Parker Follett is that she views organizations from a democratic perspective. And I respect that. My training's in political science, and I've done a lot of work in deliberative democracies and people having a voice in deliberative democracies. And so I like that she likens our organizations to being deliberative and representative democracies. So she really argues for us to look at our organizations and make our organizations into what she calls democratic organizations. Well, we all know when we talk about democracy, we talk about power coming from the people. And, not to turn this into an introduction to American government class, but a democracy means that power resides with the people, and people then have multiple avenues that they can pursue in order to participate in their own governance, to participate in making these policy decisions. Morton Grodzins, who is a very famous intergovernmental relations theorist, referred to all those multiple avenues for participation as multiple crack theory. So he argues that our system of democracy, because of our system of American federalism, creates all these cracks that people can then use to participate in the process. So some of the cracks they can use is they can write an email to their member of Congress or their member of city council or to the member of the school board or to the U.S. senator or contact the White House. They've got all these different cracks that they can pursue. So we would hope that a democratic form of government would be predicated upon the participation of people. Now, we do know that in our system of democracy, not everyone participates in their own governance. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One reason why people don't tend to participate in a democracy is because of what we call low levels of efficacy. So there are two different types of efficacy in the political science literature. And if you're a political science major, you probably know this. There's internal and external efficacy. Internal efficacy is the feeling on the part of an individual that they can understand government, they can understand politics, they can understand the policy-making process. So they have the information they need to understand what they're doing when they do participate. That's called internal efficacy. The other type of efficacy is external efficacy. External efficacy is the feeling on a part of a person that their one vote or their participation actually does make a difference. If people feel that voting makes no difference, then they're likely not to put the time and the energy into voting. So one reason why people don't participate is because of low levels of internal and external efficacy. We also know that voters are oftentimes very dissatisfied with the way in which decisions are made in our democracy. We like to think about our democracy as being pluralistic in nature. And pluralism is a type of governance whereby everyone who wants to participate in making a decision has the opportunity to participate. Very famous study by Robert Dahl back in the 1960s. And Robert Dahl was a professor at Yale University. And so he decided to use New Haven, Connecticut as his case study. So he looked at how decisions were made in New Haven, Connecticut, and who was involved in making those decisions. And what he found is it was a very pluralistic decision-making process, in that anyone who was interested in that policy, in that decision, had an opportunity to participate. And we like to think that our democracy is pluralistic. However, we also have to be realist. and understand that it's not just pluralistic, but there is also some elitist tendencies in our system as well. So the counterbalance to pluralism is elitism. Elitist power theory says that there is one unified, consistent cadre of decision makers that make decisions across an entire array of issues and problems and policies. And so, if you want someone who can be associated with elitism, at least in somewhat contemporary time, that would be Floyd Hunter. And in the 1970s, Floyd Hunter then did his own case study looking at decision making, but he did his in Atlanta, Georgia. And when he looked at decision making in Atlanta, Georgia, he came to the conclusion that there is this one very consistent cadre of elites who participate in making these decisions. This elite cadre was made up of top government officials in Atlanta, Georgia, top corporate leaders, and primarily the one corporation that for years dominated Atlanta, Georgia was Coca-Cola. And I went to APSA, American Political Science Association conference in Atlanta several years ago. It was my first time visiting downtown Atlanta, and I was struck when I walked out of the hotel and saw Coca-Cola everywhere. And park was named after Coca-Cola and buildings named after Coca-Cola. And so Coca-Cola really was one of the dominant, if not the most dominant corporation in Atlanta, Georgia. So Coca-Cola had a major hand in a lot of the decisions that were being made. There are a lot of roles to be played by lobbyists and corporate donations. And so it's a very elitist approach that Floyd Hunter said really kind of froze out a lot of average ordinary citizens from actually being able to participate in decision making. So in some respects, we have some elements of pluralism. In other respects, we tend to be a little bit more elitist in the way in which we make our decisions. I think if you look at Congress today, it's hard not to make the argument that it tends to be very elitist. Up until very recently, incumbents had very high reelection rates. Members of Congress oftentimes don't share the same demographics and the same background as the rest of us as ordinary average citizens. Members of the Senate tend to be much older than the average American, and they also tend to be exponentially more wealthy than the average American. And so those are the people who are making those decisions based upon a lot of campaign contributions and a lot of influence from corporate donors. But be that as it may, people have some disincentives to participate in a democracy. It takes effort, it takes time to participate, even if you have the ability to do it. So Mary Parker Fall argues that in a representative democracy, there are two fundamental flaws. One flaw is particularized interest, and the other flaw is passive citizens. So what we are talking about with it being difficult for people to participate, that's passive citizenry. And so citizens tend to be very passive when it comes to participating in their own self-determination. There are multiple avenues that citizens can use to participate in their own governance. You can vote. You can support a candidate. You can give money to a candidate. You can run for office. You can attend a city council or a school board meeting. You can write letters, write emails, do public records requests. There are a lot of avenues that you can use. But the least costly avenue is voting, and especially here in California, because everyone gets their mail-in vote, their mail-in ballot, and then they can just fill out that mail-in ballot at home. They can drop it at a vote center. They can drop it in a voting box. They can, at least as of now, drop it in the mail. We'll see what happens with that in the future. But it's a very passive way of participating. And people tend to participate in passive ways because they are very much rational, self-interested actors. And that's that utilitarian perspective that you want to maximize pleasure while minimizing pain, maximize benefits while minimizing costs. So she says in a democracy, people oftentimes don't participate as much as we would like to think they do in an American government textbook. So we end up with these passive citizens. The other fundamental flaw are these particularized interests. And this then harkens back to James Madison in Federalist Paper number 10. And I'm sure you talked about James Madison and what he said in Federalist Number 10 back in the 500 course. But essentially, what Madison told us in Federalist 10 is that anytime you have a democracy, especially what he referred to as a compound republic, you are going to have people and groups that have their own specific interests that they are trying to accomplish. And oftentimes, when you have all these different particularized interests, these interests will come into conflict with each other, and then you have to try and deal with that conflict. Madison, and his whole idea of this compound republic, was, all pun intended, revolutionary at that time, in that the prevailing political philosophy trended toward a compact republic. So you have Montesquieu and others who argued that the only way to really organize a system of governance is through a compact republic, where you have a small jurisdiction, and within that small jurisdiction, you have a great deal of homogeneity of opinion, that people tend to agree with each other on most issues, very homogeneous opinions, and that's your compact type of republic. Obviously, as we know, what Madison told us, not only in Federalist 10, but in Federalist 51 and other places as well, he disagreed. And he said the most effective type of government is a compound republic, where you have a large government over a large jurisdiction that is comprised of very heterogeneous opinions. And he said we cannot get rid of particularized interests in a compound republic, because getting rid of particularized interests is equivalent to getting rid of democracy. So instead, what we have to do is control their effects. And the way we can control their effects is by balancing one interest against another. And so that's why we see our separation of powers. That's why we see our system of American federalism. Those are both structures that allow us to balance interest against interest in our system of government. And it's because of sometimes the negative effects of having all these different particularized interests. So particularized interests, passivity on the part of citizens, those are the two fundamental flaws, Follett says, that are associated with a representative democracy. And if they're associated with a representative democracy at the societal level, then they will also be associated with a democratic organization at the organizational level. So she argues we need to, in our organizations, work to try and rectify these flaws. And the primary way to rectify these flaws, according to Follett, is by fostering participation. So here, Follett is really taking us pretty far afield from what we were talking about in the classical theory. In classical theory, we were not really concerned about the participation of our employees. We didn't really care to know what our employees wanted, what they thought, their opinions. We weren't asking them that. Now, here at Mary Parker Follett, we want to involve them in the decision-making process. We want to foster their participation in the daily life of the organization. So participation is the primary way that we can try and rectify these flaws that democratic organizations will have. Well, whenever you have your individual employees and groups that are engaging in participation in making decisions, you are going to, by definition, have these particularized interests coming into conflict with each other. So Follett argues that conflict is a natural part of a democratic organization. So what we need to do is we need to find the most effective way to manage that conflict. So she argues there are three different ways to manage conflict in an organization. The first way is domination. And in Follett's mind, that is by far the least effective way to deal with conflict. In domination, one party wins, one party loses. So it's very similar to in game theory, what we call a zero-sum game. That if one party is going to gain, it will do so at the detriment of the other party. She says domination, this is kind of that overt power that you may have talked about in 500. That type of domination is the least effective way to deal with conflict, because those people who are being dominated are obviously going to be disaffected. They're going to be dissatisfied. They are not going to buy into the decisions that are being made by the party that wins. So it's by far the worst way to deal with conflict. The second way is a little bit better, but still not the most appropriate, and that's compromise. So through a negotiated compromise, one party gives something up, the other party gives something up, and by having both parties give something up, we come to this compromise. Well, it's better than domination, but it is still not ideal because both parties are still giving something up. So they're still going to be somewhat dissatisfied with the resulting decision. She argues that the third way and the most effective way is through what she calls integration. So she argues if we allow participation in our organizations, people will talk to each other. And as they talk to each other, kind of in what Theodore Lowy referred to as a marketplace of ideas. That's what Lowy called our democracy, a marketplace of ideas, where people go to this marketplace of ideas and share ideas with each other. And so when you have this marketplace of ideas in your organization, people are sharing these ideas and opinions. As ideas are shared, they then interpenetrate from one person to another. And so I may hear you say something and think, well, I never really thought of that before. Maybe that is something I need to consider in making this decision. That's an interpenetration of ideas. She argues as these ideas interpenetrate between people, it allows us to then integrate all these different ideas together into the creation of a new and novel way of addressing a problem or making a decision. In that way, when we come up with a decision together and we integrate all these ideas together, everyone gets a piece of the pie. Everyone has some buy-in because everyone contributed to this answer, to this solution. Hence the reason why she argues integration is the best way to deal with the conflict that is inevitable in a democratic organization. Now, in terms of people participate at different rates depending upon the amount of power and authority that they have. And we talked about the idea of power and authority on Monday when we talked about Max Weber and his different authority bases that then breed these different administrative structures. The classical theorists really believed in what was called a power over relationship, whereby you would have leaders who would exert power over employees. Leaders, if they chose to, could delegate authority down to their employees, but it would have to be something that was being delegated from on high. That's what Follett referred to as a power over approach. And she felt that power over approach was not terribly useful. What she favored was what she referred to as a power with approach, whereby instead of just delegating authority to your employees, leaders need to help their employees develop their own basis for authority. And essentially, this is our first step toward the idea of human resource management, where we are working with our employees to help them develop as human resources, to help them develop their skills and their capabilities. And in developing their skills and their capabilities, that provides them with the resources that they need to then exercise that power and authority. So she believed there was a much more egalitarian power with approach as compared to the classical approach of power over. As she was very fond of saying, power is a resource to be developed in your employees as opposed to be a resource that is given to your employees. So power is a resource to be developed within your employees as opposed to be something that is given from top down onto your employees. Now, even though Mary Parker Follett is taking us away from the classical school and really laying the groundwork for the human relations school, we also have to remember that Mary Parker Follett was still writing in that contemporary period of scientific management where the classical school was still very much the acceptable approach. And so she still kind of has one foot in the classical world, one foot in the neoclassical world. Her one foot in the classical world really kind of looks at principles as well. And so kind of harking back to Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick and their attempt to try and come up with principles to govern organizations, Follett also provides us with some principles that need to govern all organizations as well. The first principle she tells us of organization should be coordination through integration between departments and individuals. So it's kind of this coordinative principle that we are familiar with from the classical theorists. But this is really coordination, not just coordination between leaders and members of the organization, but also coordination between individual members and departments and divisions at lower levels in our organization as well, because you need to have this integration, this interpenetration of ideas. Second principle is what she calls early contact. People need to be exposed to this idea of participation being something that's valued in the organization from their very first day in the organization. So you get to these employees early so that they understand that they are encouraged to participate, that there will not be punitive measures for their participation, and said their participation is being encouraged. So contact early in the time span of when an employee is in your organization. Take into account all perspectives. So you value all perspectives and you don't discount a perspective right out of hand. You take into account all perspectives from all people in your organization. Only by taking into account all these perspectives and kind of creating this safe space for people to share their perspectives can interpenetration of ideas occur, and we can't have an integration until we have that interpenetration of ideas. And remember that things are dynamic in our democratic organizations. They're not static, they change frequently. So the way in which you coordinate this communication and participation among the members of your organization needs to be done in a very dynamic way. It needs to change. Mary Parker Follett was also very well known for her theory of situational leadership. And we'll get into leadership in a future class session and what it means for organizations. But essentially, she gives us an idea of situational leadership, that leaders lead according to the situation. There's not necessarily one way to lead your employees. There's not necessarily one way to foster coordination and participation. It is going to depend upon the context in which you find yourself, the challenges being faced by your organization, and the employees that you are leading and managing. So it's a very dynamic and changing type of situation. So just kind of wrap up Mary Parker Follett. You could do probably an entire class on Mary Parker Follett, but Mary Parker Follett is basically serving as a very good segue from the classical school into the world of human relations and human resource management. She is taking a much more collegial, egalitarian type of approach to employees within the organization, valuing their opinions and fostering their ability to participate. So it's very easy to see that Mary Parker Follett creates a great foundation for then our later human relations theorists to then build upon with their theories. So just like every other theorist that we talk about in the class, let's take Mary Parker Follett and go back to our three different characteristics that we look at. Number one, the models of organizational effectiveness. Tompkins tells us that Mary Parker Follett emphasizes human relations model of effectiveness, and I think that's absolutely true, and it's hard to say she doesn't because she's very much in line with human relations theorists. So a human relations model of effectiveness, also emphasizing an internal process model because we are looking inside the organization, fostering participation on the part of our members in the organization. Not a whole lot of discussion beyond the walls of the organization. We really won't get to that discussion until we get more into our systems theorists that we're going to talk about then next week. And then a rational goal model. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult in that, yes, Follett really did focus on the goal of the organization in terms of the organization is effective by achieving its goals. And it achieves its goals by allowing this participation. It achieves its goals by being a democratic organization. So clearly there is still that macro level focus on achieving the goals, the stated goals of the organization. But here again is a point in time where it would be very helpful if we could have gradations in our shading of the cells. Because I would certainly shade in human relations, model of organizational effectiveness, much more than I would rational goal. And I probably have the darkest shading in would be human relations model, then followed by internal process, then followed by rational goal. Well, how about our methods for coordination control of work? Here is where we have a novel approach. And instead of the direct supervision and the standardization that we saw on Monday with our classical theorists, now we have mutual adjustment. Mutual adjustment is where you allow workers to consult with each other and to make decisions and to share ideas between each other. Again, that's all this idea of interpenetration and integration. So here, for the first time, we have a value being placed upon mutual adjustment as opposed to standardization and direct supervision. Then, in terms of our methods for motivating our employees, our motivational strategies, here within instrumental rewards, we have things such as considerate leadership. Considerate leadership is paying attention to and listening to your employees, paying attention to their wants, needs, and desires and their concerns, treating them as individual human beings. Group acceptance. When people participate and they interpenetrate ideas and integrate ideas together, they are oftentimes doing it within the context of a group. So it's important that we recognize that groups are important for organizations, formal as well as informal groups. And then job identification. And this job identification is something that will be a very common theme as we move into our HR and especially our human resource management theorists. Job identification, we mentioned this before, is when people actually have a hand in the creation of their jobs and they feel that their jobs will help them develop as human resources, to develop their skill sets and develop their abilities that will then help them aspire to self-actualization or their career goals or whatever the case may be. The more someone identifies with their job, the more likely they are to be engaged and motivated in carrying out the duties of that job. So we can see that we certainly have different things being emphasized in terms of the coordination and control, as well as in terms of our motivational strategies. So that is Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett, again, today is a very famous theorist. She gets a lot of acclaim in organization theory classes such as this. I talk about her extensively in my PPA 500 course as well as in this course because I am a big fan of Mary Parker Follett. But I just really credit her with, again, being on the cutting edge of this whole idea of human relations. She was talking about these things decades, 20 years before we ended up getting other people like Elton Mayo and Roethlisberger really kind of developing this school of human relations. So even though she's a pre-human relations theorist, she really does help us understand the entire school of human relations. So building off of Mary Parker Follett, our neoclassical school of human relations again starts to really focus on individual employees within organizations. So instead of just always being at the macro level, now we start looking at the micro level as well and looking at the behavior of our individual employees and why they behave in the way in which they behave. However, and this is a big caveat with human relations, is that human relations theory is not all unicorns and rainbows. In that, yes, we're looking at the micro level, we're focusing on the wants and needs of our individual employees, but we are doing that for a purpose. And the purpose is to get more contributions and work out of those employees, to make those employees more productive so they can then better contribute to the overall effectiveness of the organization in achieving its goals. So even though we're looking at the micro level at employees, in human relations theory, our final goal is still macro in nature, in that we're still trying to make our organizations as productive and effective and efficient as possible. So our first real human relations theorist is Elton Mayo. And Elton Mayo is useful for us for a variety of reasons. One reason is that he brings a psychological orientation to our understanding of organizations. So back in the classical school, Max Weber brought this sociology/law approach to our understanding of an organization. Frederick Taylor brought his engineering degree and engineering background. Uh, Gulick and Fail and Mooney really brought this focus on management and development of management skills and kind of generic management skills, oftentimes out of the private sector, with the exception of Gulick, who is a little bit more of the application to the public sector. And that's why we always talk about it as kind of being our public administration theorist. But here we have a psychological uh, flair that's coming in, if you will, from Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo made the argument that we had problems in our organizations, especially in our industrial organizations, because of what we refer to as social disorganization. So our institutions were disorganized because society was also disorganized. So it's a much bigger root problem than just how we structure the organization. It's really social disorganization that is having this impact upon our organizations. He argues that we have this social disorganization generally because of two reasons. One reason is because of human irrationality. He argues that, again, employees are human beings. And these are oftentimes human beings working in these industries who start working in these factories at a very early age. And so when you look at the artifacts of the Industrial Revolution, and you have all of these industries that start popping up in our major northern cities, our Rust Belt cities, so the Chicagos, the Detroits, and the Clevelands, and the Pittsburghs, the New Yorks. That's where all these industries start popping up. These industries obviously need to have people to work in them. At that same time that we had industry flourishing in these, what would come to be known as the Rust Belt cities, we then also had a decline in farming in our southern states. And so, because of the Great Depression, we had the bottom falling out in terms of farm prices, and a lot of farmers were losing their farms. Well, they needed to have jobs somewhere, and so they then migrated up to these Rust Belt cities and took these jobs in these industrial factories and steel mills and steel plants up in the Rust Belt. When they did that, they oftentimes did that at a relatively young age. And my family has a really direct tie to all of this. Not to belabor this too much, but my grandfather was a dairy farmer in the hills of Kentucky. And after the Great Depression, or as a result of the Great Depression, he ended up losing his dairy farm. And so all of his sons, including my father, then moved at a very young age up to the Cleveland, Ohio area. And they all took jobs working in steel mills. And my father worked in a steel factory for the rest of his life. And they all did it at this very young age. And this idea of people moving out of their nuclear families at a young age, Mayo would argue, led to a lot of irrationality of these young employees when they were working in these industries. There are a lot of psychological things that they had not worked out yet with their families because they were leaving their families at 15 and 16 years old. They didn't have the emotional maturity yet in order to function effectively and behave in rational manners while working in these industrial settings. And so that's where this human irrationality comes from. So if you have these employees who are working in these factories at a very young age, they're also working in a factory setting, and the factory setting really compounds this irrationality in that the factory setting was a very centralized, top-down type of environment where people were doing the exact same job every single day for 20 or 30 years, working very unsafe work environments. My first job was working in the steel mill, and that's one of the reasons why I went on to get my PhD and do what I do today. It's not an easy job. It's a difficult job. You come home, covered in dirt. It's a very difficult type of setting. And so we're putting these very young, emotionally immature people into these very difficult factory settings. And that is what ends up causing what he referred to as disorganization. So Mayo and his colleagues, their primary job, their primary goal was to try and understand how we can make changes to these organizations to help these employees better mature emotionally. and to be a better fit in terms of these organizations in which they are working. So, as a psychologist or with a psychology background, Mayo and his colleagues really believed in observation, as many psychologists do. It's a behavioral science after all. And so you observe the behavior of individuals to kind of learn how they behave and why they behave in the ways in which they do. So that in a lot of these observational types of research case studies, we're not going to go into all of them, obviously, but the one that we're going to pull out for our discussion tonight will be the illumination studies, and in particular, Mayo's study of the Hawthorne electrical plant. Does anyone remember the Hawthorne electrical studies and what happened in those studies at the Hawthorne electrical plant and what Mayo and his colleagues found as a result of their Hawthorne experiments? I don't know how much you got into this in a previous class, but there's a really important term that comes out of these Hawthorne experiments that you'll talk about in 696 in research methods, and that is the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect in research means that people will act differently when they know they're being watched. And Eric, yes, absolutely. It was the one where they worked harder because they were together and they were being paid attention to. Absolutely. And that was kind of the takeaway, is that Mayo and his colleagues decided, let's look at what will make people more productive on the job. So they started with something very simple. Let's look at the impact of a physical stimulus on work productivity. And one of the physical stimuli that they chose was the lighting level. So hypothesis number one was if we turn the lights up, people will be able to see their work better, and so therefore they will become more productive. So we turn the lights up, sure enough, people become more productive. Well, then surely if we turn the lighting level down, people will not be able to see as well and they'll become less productive. But when they turn the lighting level down, productivity continued to increase. And Mayo realized it wasn't that physical stimulus of the lighting level that was causing an increase in productivity. It was the social aspect that they were talking to these employees. They were paying attention to them. They were asking them questions about their experience on a daily basis in doing their jobs. They were putting them into groups together and measuring the productivity of those groups. And so people really, for the first time, had an opportunity to interact with each other in a social manner in these groups. And that is what was motivating these employees to work harder and to be more productive. So essentially, what Mayo tells us is he says that organizations are also social environments. Factory settings oftentimes completely overlooked the social aspect of the workplace. We need to recognize that these are social types of environments and that our employees have social types of needs. And so, therefore, if we allow them to participate in groups, if we pay attention to them, it's that which will really make them more productive. So, we're these psychological types of needs that we were meeting that would then make our employees more productive. And if our employees are more productive, then in turn, obviously, our organization is going to be more productive as well. So the two main things that come out of Mayo studies, number one, the recognition of the social environment within an organization, and then number two, the recognition of the importance of groups. When they would put people together in groups, the productivity of those groups was significantly higher than the productivity of individual employees. Now, that's got to be to be expected in that once you put people together, the collective set of knowledge, skills, and abilities may certainly outweigh the knowledge, skills, and abilities of one individual. But the productivity of groups went even beyond that. It was such a big increase in productivity. It wasn't just that collective knowledge, skills, and abilities, but instead it was if a member of the group felt that, if the group felt that a member of the group was not working hard enough, and if they were not pulling the weight, if they were soldiering, as Frederick told us about on Monday evening, then the other members of the group would obviously put pressure on them to work harder to then make the group look better and to become more productive. So now we have this recognition of social organizations. That is something that we obviously didn't care a bit about in many of our classical theories from Monday. Another human relations theorist that really builds upon Elton Mayo is Fritz Roethlisberger. And it's probably outdated now to say he's not Ben. I guess Ben's been retired for many, many years. But Ben Roethlisberger graduated from my alma mater, so I always put Ben on there. But this is Fritz Roethlisberger. And Fritz Roethlisberger made an argument to us that we needed to develop a new discipline that focused on the interactions of humans within our organizations. So this discipline would help us make our organizations more effective by focusing on the interactions between our human employees. Roethlisberger argues that this new discipline would need to, number one, focus on problems with communication. So if you have people who are interacting with each other, we know that whenever human beings interact, there can be a lot of problems with effective communication. There can be distortion of information. The mode or medium of communication could also make for a problem with communication. So he said we need to focus on how people are communicating with each other, identify the problems with their communication, and then try and rectify those problems. Secondly, our discipline needs to focus on getting cooperation among our employees. Now, here is a relatively novel approach as compared to the classical school. In the classical school, you didn't care very much about the cooperation of your employees. You used legal compliance. You said, here is what you must do. This is how you must do it. This is when it must be done. If you don't do that, then here are the punitive measures, the penalties that will be applied to you. Very centralized, very top down. Here we're acknowledging that if we want to be productive as an organization, we need to get the cooperation on the part of our employees. They need to cooperate in order to provide the contributions that we need to be productive as an organization. And then number three, to focus on maintaining individual and organizational equilibrium through change. So Roethlisberger believed that this new discipline of organizations needs to look at the idea of equilibrium, this balance between the individual and the organization. If the individual feels they're getting what they need out of the organization, then the individual will be much more satisfied and hopefully more motivated, as we'll see in the second part of our class tonight. If the organization is getting the contributions that it feels it needs to get from its individual employees, then the organization is going to be productive and effective at achieving its goals. But we need to maintain this equilibrium between what our employees need and what our organization needs, recognizing that this equilibrium is very dynamic, that this equilibrium, this balance will change over time. Whenever we recognize that situations change, like we did with Mary Parker Follett, like we're doing here with Roethlisberger, it really does start to pull us away from that one-size-fits-all approach. It makes us recognize that we have to take context into account. Hence the reason why my favorite answer to all questions is it depends. It depends upon the context of the situation. So now taking Mayo and Roethlisberger together, we are now really starting to view our organizations as social systems, placing a value upon the behaviors and the needs of our individual employees and how they interact with each other in this social system. And recognizing that since our organizations are social systems, they're more than just the formal organization chart. That there are informal aspects to our organizations that can have major impacts upon our effectiveness and our productivity as an institution. We have informal groups that form. One example, when I taught back in Illinois, I was in a political science department. It was a big department. I think we had 18 or 20 faculty members. But there is a subset of faculty members who really hung together very, very closely. We called them the lunch bunch. And the lunch bunch, they were all from Southern universities. One was from Ole Miss. One had his PhD from Florida. One has PhD from Kentucky. I think there's one who has PhD from Alabama. They really hung together as a lunch bunch. And every day they would go out to lunch together. And then lo and behold, whenever we'd have our faculty meetings, the lunch bunch all shared the same opinion, and they all voted in the same manner. They had formed their own kind of informal subset of the faculty that really had an impact upon our decision making as a faculty as a whole. So we need to recognize that because of this social system, there will be these informal groups that can have a lot of impact and a lot of sway on the organization. So now we're starting to look at the organization as a social system focusing on human interactions. This idea of human interactions and focusing on human interactions is also a major tenet of this person by the name of Chester Barnard, who again you may have been introduced to in PPA 500. Chester Barnard is one of these theorists that we are going to talk about in more than one context in this class. Here we're talking about Chester Barnard and his contribution to the School of Human Relations. Next week, when we talk about systems theory, we'll talk about Chester Barnard and his contribution to our understanding of natural or closed systems theory. So he has a lot of applicability in this class. But here for tonight, we're looking at his contribution to the growth and development of human relations school. Chester Barnard made the argument, just like Roethlisberger did, that in order for a leader or manager to be effective, that leader or manager must get the compliance, the acquiescence of their employees. Essentially, Chester Barnard looked at leadership and management from a very transactional lens. If you've had any classes or any work in leadership, you know one major type of leadership is transactional leadership. Well, this is what Chester Barnard is all about. The transaction here between the leader and the employee will be that the leader needs to extract contributions from the employee. And in order to get those contributions, the leader will provide incentives to induce that employee to provide those contributions. Now, by contributions, we are talking about the amount of effort that the person puts toward their job. We're talking about their loyalty to the organization. Their belief in the goals of the organization, all of those things, the amount of time they spend in the organization, all those types of things are contributions that employees can give to the organization, and in exchange, the organization will then provide those employees with what Chester Barnard calls selective incentives. So perhaps they'll get rewarded with pay if pay for performance is possible. Perhaps they'll get rewarded with a recognition as Employee of the Week, or a new office that they've had their eye on, or maybe a plum parking space in the garage, whatever it is. These are incentives that will be given to employees in this type of transaction. So what Barnard tells us is in order to know what types of contributions we need from employees and then how to incentivize those contributions, we have to recognize the differences between our employees. That employees are no longer just this replaceable anonymous cogs in the machinery as they were with Frederick Taylor. Now they are unique, different human beings, and we have to treat them as such. Now our goal is still the macro goal of getting the contributions to make our organizations productive and effective. So we still are trying to achieve organizational goals, but we are doing it by focusing on individual employees and what those individual employees need. Also, Barnard realized that we had to get the compliance on the part of our employees. We had to be careful to ask our employees to do things that do not violate their values, norms, and ethical standards. If you ask an employee to take an action, and that action will violate their value system, chances are they're going to push back very hard on that request, and you will probably not get their compliance, and you will not get the contributions that you need from that employee. This is what Barnard refers to as the zone of indifference. Every employee has their own unique zone of indifference. In that zone of indifference, if you ask an employee to take an action that falls within their zone of indifference, they're probably going to do it because it doesn't matter that much to them. It doesn't violate their ethics or their values. So as long as a leader, you can work within that person's zone of indifference, you are much likely to get their acquiescence and their compliance. But once you ask them to do something that is outside of their zone of indifference, that's when you're going to get pushback and you're not going to get the contributions that you need. So, what this means is again that people are unique. Every employee will have a different zone or a unique zone of indifference. So, we have to know our employees, know what their wants, needs, and desires are, and then know what their individual unique zones of indifference look like in order to be able to extract the contributions that we need to make our organizations effective. So the addition here from Chester Barnard is really building on Fritz Roethlisberger that we need to understand the unique nature of our individual employees. Now, this whole idea of paying attention to your employees, being cognizant of their wants, needs, and desires, their skills, those types of areas of focus are really embedded very strongly in many of our contemporary modern organizations. If you look at your organization that you're working in, your organization probably has some type of an employee counseling program, oftentimes referred to as an employee assistance program, an EAP. That is an artifact of human relations school. Your organization probably also has a vigorous training and development mechanism and machinery, whereby you are able to provide this professional development training to your employees to help them augment and enhance their skill set. And the type of training that is provided will differ depending upon the employee and the position that employee is in and the types of skills that they need to acquire in order to be able to provide the right contributions to the organization. So those are just a couple of ways that we see human relations theory alive and well in our modern organizations. So when we look at Mayo and Roethlisberger and Barnard as our three primary drivers of human relations school, I think that when we look at the models of organizational effectiveness, clearly they are all emphasizing the human relations model. We are looking at individual employees. We are looking at trying to build a cohesion and a morale among those employees so that we can extract the contributions we need from those employees. So clearly a human relations model of effectiveness. We are being effective if we are extracting those contributions by appealing to the wants, needs, and desires of our employees and providing them with the right set of incentives so they'll provide the contributions that we need. In terms of the mechanisms for control, this is one that may seem a little surprising, and that Tompkins argues that the focus is primarily still on direct supervision. So Mary Parker Fall was mutual adjustment, but now here we are back to the direct supervision that was so common under the classical school. And the reason why we say that it's direct supervision with the human relations school is that a lot of later theorists, especially those in the human resource management school that will come next, criticize human relations theorists as being exploitative, that they're only paying attention to employees in order to get what they need out of those employees. So it's still kind of this top-down, what can you do for the organization? So it still is kind of that centralization type of exploitative relationship between leaders, supervisors, and their employees. In terms of our methods for motivating our employees, there is some considerate leadership here because obviously we are talking to employees and we're paying attention to what they need and what they value. And also there is obviously group acceptance as well. In that in human relations theory with Mayo and Roethlisberger, people are working together in groups. And we've understood that because of the social aspect of organizations, when people work together in groups, they can be more effective than when they are working in singular, isolated fashion. So I think the way to look at human relations theory is that human relations theory is, again, moving us farther away from classical theory, but still has a few reminiscent characteristics, such as that macro level approach at the end of the day. What we're doing is focusing on individual employees in a micro type of approach in order to achieve those macro level organizational goals. So that's what we consider to be the human relations school. If you're looking at this in terms of chronological evolution of the literature, here we are looking at primarily 1940s, 1950s, and the 1960s. That's kind of this human relations period of time. The primary critique, though, as we said, of human relations theory is that it's exploitative, and that this focus on individual employees is not being done to help them develop as resources, but rather is being done to incentivize them to then provide the contributions needed for the organization. And so that criticism of being exploitative is the primary reason why we saw the rise of our next school, which is the School of Human Resource Management Theory, or HRM. Human resource management theorists felt that this one-way street of the human relations theorists, where the human relations theorists merely looked at what can the employee give to the organization, now the human resource management theorists start to view it as a two-way street. It's not just what the individual can do for the organization, but now what can the organization do for the individual employee? So, take that John F. Kennedy phrase and kind of butcher it a little bit. John F. Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Well, here we're asking the question, ask not what the individual can do for the organization, but ask what the organization can do for the individual. So the major thing that really sets human resource management apart from human relations is that in human resource management, there is inherent value in helping people develop their skills, to develop their abilities for the sake of the individual. So even if that individual, after they receive their training, even if that individual, once they get their training, have decided that they are going to move on somewhere else to another organization, in human resource management theory, that is acceptable because we have helped them develop as a human resource, and that in and of itself is a valuable goal, even if it is divorced from the goal of organizational effectiveness. So there's an inherent value in developing your employees as human resources. Hence the reason why it's referred to as human resource management theory. So where we usually start our discussion of human resource management school is with our good friend Abraham Maslow. And now here Abraham Maslow is bringing to us a psychological type of approach. So we saw that from Elton Mayo. We saw a little of that from Henri Fayol. Now we're seeing psychology come back again with Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow and his very famous hierarchy of needs, that's familiar to the majority of students across a broad range of disciplines because it's been applied. It's been applied not just in psychology, it's been applied here, it's been applied in political science, it's been applied in criminal justice, it's been applied in human services. It's really been applied across the board. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you're probably already familiar with, is that every individual will have their own unique hierarchy of needs. And there are these 5 levels of needs that he puts into this hierarchy. The bottom level is what he calls physiological needs. And so these are your needs as a human being for food, water, warmth, rest, your physiological needs to stay alive. So that's your basic need. The next level of needs, your security and safety needs. You need to feel safe and secure from harm. Next level up, belongingness and love needs. You need to feel that you are in relationships, that you have friends, that you belong to something that's a little bit bigger than yourself. Next level up are your esteem needs. The need to feel that you have prestige, a feeling that people respect you and you're held in high esteem by people who you have esteem for. Those are your esteem needs. So those 4 needs are what Maslow refers to as our deficiency needs, which means that people will be motivated to fill a deficiency in those needs. However, once the deficiency has been filled and satisfied, it then ceases to be a motivator. So once you have all the food that you need and you have the shelter that you need, food and shelter will then cease to be an immediate motivator for you. So deficiency needs are you're motivated by a deficiency in those needs. Then at the apex of your pyramid, you have this thing called self-actualization. Self-actualization is achieving one's full potential. Essentially, it's kind of what the Army used to tell us was be all that you can be. If you remember those old, I'm probably dating myself. I think they're back now, though. I think they're kind of running those same commercials that join the Army and be all you can be, achieve your utmost potential. That is self-actualization. Self-actualization is considered to be a growth need. Growth needs never end. So we are always working towards self-actualization. So we will never truly accomplish full self-actualization. Every day we are working toward it. The importance here with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that number one, everyone has a hierarchy, but the ordering of the hierarchy can differ between individuals. So therefore, it means we need, as leaders and managers, to know our employees to understand the hierarchy of their needs. Secondly, we have to understand what they need at that point in time. So if they're in one of the deficiency need levels, then it's a matter of just appealing to trying to rectify those deficiencies. However, if those have all been rectified and they are now at the self-actualization growth level, then we need to provide them with opportunities to grow as human beings. This is where your professional development, your training and development really comes into play, is in terms of that growth need of self-actualization. Now, the idea of self-actualization is important because it is really the foundation of what Chris Ardress, another human resource management theorist, will talk to us about in a couple of minutes. But before we leave Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, one thing I do want to highlight to you is that later in Abraham Maslow's life, when he got to the end of his career, he revisited this hierarchy of needs and he made some changes to it. In the last manifestation of his hierarchy of needs, he modified this growth need of self-actualization, and he modified it to something more like the need to leave a legacy. That he argued that the growth need really went beyond just an individual, and it really went toward what can that individual provide to others, and how can that individual leave a legacy to make the lives better of those around them and their community. So it's kind of like a little bit bigger than oneself, and so there's a little bit different of a conceptualization of self-actualization. That's kind of his revised, modified hierarchy of needs that he created just before the end of his life. That is Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. A big believer in Maslow's hierarchy of needs was Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor, you probably covered him in 500, is best known for his X and Y theories. His X theory, and I'm going to say X theory instead of the other way around, because every time when I have my phone next to me and I say it the other way around, it sounds like I'm saying SIRI. And if I say that, then my phone starts answering me and starts talking to me during our class. So I'm being very careful and say the X theory approach of Douglas McGregor. In that X approach, Douglas McGregor makes the argument that that approaches individual employees as being very lazy, being unmotivated, being unintelligent, being non-creative, wanting to recreate more than work. It's a very negative view of individual human nature. The opposite of that, he says, is the Y theory. And the Y theory is people are motivated, they are intelligent, they are creative and innovative. The desire to work is as natural as the desire for leisure and to recreate, a much more positive view of individual employees. McGregor was a realist. And so he says not all of our employees are Y types of employees. But he will say the majority of our employees tend to be in the Y category. There are still some employees who are X employees. We've still always got some, for lack of a better term, clunkers in our organization. But for the most part, the vast majority of our employees are Y. The problem is they are Y types of employees working in X types of organizations. So our typical organization, Douglas McGregor was writing in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Douglas McGregor looked at our organizations and said they're very X-like classical organizations. in that they have all these different elements of a Barian type of bureaucracy, this tall hierarchy, this scalar chain, this unity of command, this task specialization, written rules and regulations. They're very X types of organizations. The problem is when you take a Y employee and you shoehorn them into a classical X organization, they are never going to be able to achieve or even come close to working toward self-actualization and working toward those growth types of needs. X types of organizations are ill-suited for helping employees with their growth needs. So what McGregor argues is that we need to try and take these X types of organizations and transform them into Y organizations. And this is not an easy process. This is not an overnight process, and there are lots of different ways to do it. But the one strategy that he focused on a lot was a strategy of what he referred to as job enrichment. And that's very much in alignment with job identification as one of our motivational strategies. Job enrichment is where we allow employees to participate in the defining of their job tasks. So they have the opportunity to help determine what types of things they'll be doing on a daily basis, what types of skills they will be able to acquire so that they can acquire the skills they need to grow as human beings. The more you allow them to participate in designing their jobs, the more enriched the job becomes and the more the person identifies with that position. But it also allows the job to help them grow and meet the types of future career aspirations or personal aspirations that those individual employees may have. So job enrichment is that one common strategy that can take an X type of organization and help transform it into a Y type of organization. Now, Douglas McGregor had a student, Chris Argyris. And Chris Argyris was doing a lot of his writings in the 1980s and the 1990s. Chris Argyris built off of Douglas McGregor's X theory and Y theory and used them to develop what he referred to as his personal growth theories. So essentially what Chris Argyris tells us is that people, the majority of people are kind of on the theory, oh, I just did it, the Y theory side of the scale, but they're not there automatically. That it's a developmental process. It's a maturation process they go through to move from X to Y. It is the job of the organization to help these employees go through this personal growth trajectory to move from X to Y. He says as people go through this personal growth journey, they go through different things such as experiencing increasing activism. They become more active actors, if you will, in their lives. They feel that they can more actively affect their lives and the things around them. So their jobs and their organizations must contribute to opportunities for this type of activism. People, as they go through the personal growth journey, also experience increasing independence. They become much more independent thinkers. They don't need the same type of top-down micromanagement that they may have needed when they were more on the X side of the spectrum. And so organizations need to back off of that micromanagement, allow them the opportunity to have dominance, if you will, over the jobs that they're doing on a daily basis. Third, as people go through this growth journey, they end up behaving in multiple different ways. And that there's not just one way in which they behave. Now they're able to behave in a multitude of different ways, depending upon the situation in which they find themselves. So delegating more latitude and flexibility to these individuals would make sense because they have the opportunity to do a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. They tend to develop deepening interests. And so their interests are not as superficial as they used to be. It's not just about how much money am I going to make next year. That's still important, but their interests become deeper than that. Their interests become about, their community and how what they're doing can benefit their community and make lives better for other people. So much deepening types of interests. They start to take on a longer time perspective. So it's not just about what do I need to do for tomorrow. Now they're looking 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road. They aspire to superordinate positions. So they want to move into management and leader positions with more authority and more responsibility. So our organizations need to afford them with that opportunity to move into those superordinate positions. And they also develop more self-awareness. This is kind of that emotional maturity when they really start to learn who they are. They become comfortable with who they are. They become aware of who they are. They're kind of more comfortable in their own skin. And so they're much more likely to seek out these opportunities to continue to grow. They're much more likely to share their opinions and their thought processes because they're much more aware of who they are as a human being. Now, just like McGregor, Ardress tells us that classic organization theory and classic organizations inhibit this personal growth process. So it's important for organizations to foster this growth process. And again, a way you can foster it is through by giving your employees more flexibility and latitude in terms of determining what they do and how they do it on a daily basis, by allowing them to have some say in the types of professional development opportunities that they are afforded. I know here at the university, at least in my department, when I was department chair, whenever I would do our evaluations for our staff members, there was a part at the end of that evaluation where staff members were able to share with me the types of skills that they wanted to develop in their next performance year. And then I could then find professional development opportunities that could then help them develop those types of skills. That's an example of being more of a why-oriented type of organization to help these people work their way through this personal growth type of trajectory. So, taken together, McGregor and Ardress have a very dim view of our classical organizations, but a much more positive view of our employees. But the big addition that we get from Chris Ardress is that it is a process. People go through a maturation process. Organizations also need to go through this maturation process to help our employees go through their personal growth journey. So in human resource management, it sets itself apart from human relations because there is inherent value in helping people grow as human beings, even if that growth ultimately will benefit another organization in the future down the line. There's inherent benefit in helping people go through their personal growth journey. So, human resource management school, in relation to our models of organizational effectiveness, clearly there's a human relations aspect to it. There's clearly an internal process model aspect because we are still looking within the organization and the relationship between the members and the organization itself, not really looking out there into the external environment. And there's a focus on the rational goal model. It's just here, the goal is not always the organization goal. It can be the goal of the individual employee. So again, not just what the individual does for the organization, what can the organization do for the individual? In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, we are back with Mary Parker Follett and mutual adjustment. Here we are consulting with our workers, allowing them to consult with each other, giving them the flexibility to be able to self-determine how they do things on a daily basis, much different than that direct supervision type of approach. And then also with our motivational strategies, here it's clearly going to be job identification. We said the primary approach is job enrichment. The more you can help the employee enrich the job the way in which they want to, the more they are likely to identify with the job. The more they identify with that job, the more likely they are to then be motivated and have incentive to go out there and acquire those skills. And the more skills they acquire, obviously it will benefit the organization, but it will also benefit the individual employee. So again, it's a much, I don't want to use the term warmer and fuzzier, but I guess I will. It's a much warmer and fuzzier way of dealing with individuals than what we saw with human relations, and certainly a lot more so than what we saw with the classical school. So now we have worked our way up from the late 1800s up until the 1980s and the 1990s with Chris Argyris. In this evolution, we have again moved more away from the one size fits all approach, recognizing the uniqueness and the unique needs of our individual employees. We've also then moved away from this whole idea of a only macro level approach, where it's only what's good for the organization. Now we're taking a much more micro and management level approach. We're asking the question, what is in the best interest of our individual employees as well? So that kind of covers what we usually present in terms of those neoclassical schools of human relations and human resource management. Do you have any questions? Do you have any observations or comments? I know I've been talking for about an hour and a half. I'm sorry for that, but there is a lot of information for us to cover in a very short time together. Any questions or any observations? Okay. Then I would propose this is a perfect time for a break. And yeah, it is interesting to see human resource management really has become obviously rooted in our organization, so much so that we have our human resource offices, we have our human resource analysts, and in a lot of organizations, all those human resource functions are tending to be centralized even more in those offices of human resources because of all the civil service requirements, although some of those we'll see what happens with those in the future in the current administration, but also collective bargaining agreements and all those stipulations and CBAs sometimes will make it difficult for our line managers to be able to manage their human resources without running afoul of some of those regulations and stipulations. And so that has led to a growth in the size of these human resource offices. And so, if you are interested in becoming a human resource analyst or human resource officer, that's where a lot of these jobs tend to be in our public organizations. And I'll also mention too, if you like numbers and you like budgeting and finance, that's another good area in public organizations. Public organizations are always looking for people who can be finance managers and be directors of finance. So much so that a lot of governments are having trouble finding MPAs with that interest. And so they've been going into business schools and getting MBAs instead. The preference would be an MPA, but they can't find them, so they go and get those MBAs. So if you have any interest at all in a career in finance, that is a pretty open field now in a lot of public organizations. But that's just a little aside for you if you're looking to maybe change jobs or if you're not in the public sector looking for a way into the public sector. Okay, I'm ready for a break. I'm sure you're ready for a break as well. So it's almost so let's see, let's take a break until 7:45. We'll round it off, say it's 7:30. We'll take a break until 7:45. When you come back at 7:45, like I said at the outset of class, we will turn our attention then to motivational theories because they really dovetail so well with human resource management theory. And in fact, some of our motivational theorists, like Elton, not Elton Mill, but Abraham Maslow and Douglas McGregor, are also represented in what we'll talk about in the second half of class tonight. So there's that much overlap between motivational school and human resource management that kind of makes sense to kind of do them both together in the same evening. So take a break to 7:45. We will come back and we will talk about motivation. Okay, we are back. It is 7:45. So, like I said, in the second part of class, I'd like to move into a discussion of motivational theories. And as I told you before, the reason why we do it now is because it really is a nice connection to human resource management theory. So, in human resource management theory, we are looking at individual employees, and we're trying to help those employees in their personal growth journey, trying to help them develop as human resources. Obviously, when we help them develop as human resources, enhancing their skills, enhancing their abilities, then they hopefully will become more productive as well. But motivation is another important element in productivity. that even though someone has the skills and abilities, if they are not willing to exert those skills and abilities and utilize them on a daily basis, then you're probably not going to see the productivity that you would hope to see as an organization. So, building off of human resource management theory, we basically saw another school that kind of developed known as motivational school. And the motivational school of organization theory, the theorists in that school, we'll talk about 8 different theorists, we'll put them in 2 different categories, but the theorists in that school really have come to a conclusion that there really is no science of motivation. Now, in the classical theories, we are very much looking at an identifiable science that we could then apply in all situations. Here in the School of Motivation Theory, we have recognized that there is no true science of motivation. Instead, motivation is much more of a craft with techniques and ideas and insights. So, the goal of motivation theory is not to develop that one size fits all approach, but rather to identify the discrete techniques and concepts and ideas that will help us motivate employees within our organization. Now, we are talking about motivation of employees within the context of the public sector. Just like with everything else, the context of the public sector is far different from the context of the private sector. Here in the public sector, we have a lot of constraints placed upon our ability to motivate our employees. Extrinsic incentives are oftentimes off of the table for us in the public sector. We have position classification systems, we have pay grades and step and column types of systems. We simply do not have the flexibility to offer pay for performance for our employees in many situations in the public sector. So our focus in the public sector is going to be much more on those intrinsic types of incentives. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these constraints and limitations in the public sector in terms of how we can motivate our employees. In addition to what we said about the limitations on incentives, if you are interested in reading more about the limitation on extrinsic incentives, the focus on intrinsic incentives, Hal Rainey, Rex Facer, and others have done a lot of work in this area. I served with Rex Facer, and we were on the commission for accreditation with NASPA. He was also a member of the Compensation Commission for the Obama administration. Really has a wealth of experience, both scholarly and practical, when it comes to the idea of incentives. So if you're interested in the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic incentives and why we focus more on intrinsic incentives, Hal Rainey and Rex Facer are both very good sources to go to. But we know we have the limitation on incentives. We also know that we have structures that are extremely complex, especially as our public organizations age and start going through this rigidity cycle. They tend to become very fragmented. They fragment not just their power, but they also fragment their structure, which then makes it more difficult for us to come up with a set of skills and techniques and concepts that will help us motivate all of our employees. We also know that in the public sector in our organizations, we face a lot of ambiguity. We have a lot of goal ambiguity. We don't have agreement on our goals. Our goals are very difficult to measure. We tend to have unstable and ambiguous expectations for performance. We tend to lack a lot of the cohesion in our work groups that you might see in private corporations. So all of those things contribute to making motivation even more challenging in a public organization. And then we also have these external influences, primarily the negative view that the public holds for bureaucracy. Charles Goodsell wrote that very famous book back in 1970, The Case for the Bureaucracy, and he described to us just how negative the view is of members of the public when they look at the bureaucracy. When people have a negative view of the bureaucracy, it also means they typically have a negative view of bureaucrats as well. If administrators in our public organizations are constantly being told by members of the public and by elected officials how inefficient and ineffective they are, sometimes how much fraud and corruption they engage in, and you just hear this over and over again, it's difficult for you to incentivize those employees and to motivate those employees to work harder and to achieve the goals that they originally wanted to achieve. So I think all those things combine to make motivation even more challenging in a public organization. But at the very basic level, when we're talking about motivation, motivation basically refers to a person's desire to work hard and work well and to exert effort on a consistent basis. So typically, when we're talking about motivation, we are talking about the exertion of effort and putting forth that effort on a consistent basis. And indeed, in some of the theories that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, we will see that the primary goal of those theories is how are we going to go about enhancing and increasing the effort of our employees. So motivation really gets down to the idea of exerting a consistent amount of effort on a consistent basis. Another problem for us with motivation in the public sector is that when we are measuring motivation of employees, we are clearly needing to collect that data directly from those employees. So the information we're going to use to measure someone's motivation will come from that individual employee. We oftentimes collect that information through the use of surveys. Now, I'm sure you've all talked about surveys before, undergraduate and research methods courses. When you do 696 research methods, you will spend probably about a week or so talking about the construction of surveys. Surveys can be very good, flexible data collection tools. If they are constructed correctly, they can collect both qualitative as well as quantitative information. We can collect qualitative information with open-ended survey questions. We can then collect quantitative numerical information from closed-ended survey questions as well. So they're very flexible, holistic types of tools. However, if they are not structured appropriately, you're going to end up with a lot of measurement error. So it's important that we write our questions so that they are understandable, that the response categories that we assign to those questions match those questions, that we sequence our questions in a reasonable type of sequencing so that if we have some sensitive types of questions, and sometimes when we question people about their motivational levels, those questions can get to be relatively sensitive, that those sensitive questions are not at the beginning of the survey, that they tend to be buried later on in the survey. By putting your sensitive questions later in surveys, you increase your response rates. That's the whole economic idea of sunk cost. That if someone is filling out a 20-question survey and they hit that sensitive question in question number 18, they've already completed 17 questions. So even if they don't want to answer that sensitive question, since they've already completed 17 of 20 questions, they're far more likely to go ahead and submit that survey than if that sensitive question is in question 1, 2, or 3. So it's important that we sequence our questions appropriately. But if we do a good job with our surveys, we can measure employee motivation through those surveys. So here are some examples of survey questions that are oftentimes used to measure employee motivation. The first type of survey is what's known as a job motivation scale. In a job motivation scale, we ask specific questions such as, on most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? So someone feels obviously that their time is dragging on the job. They're probably not very engaged, not very motivated in their work. Some people are completely involved in their job. They're absorbed in it night and day. For other people, their job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel in your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that isn't really required of you? Would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in your organization? So those are some typical questions that we see on what we call a job motivation scale. Then a second approach is what's called a work motivation scale. In the work motivation scale, you have indicators such as I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. And again, you would attach this statement then with your like or ordinal response categories. Typically, you'll use categories such as strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, because you want to have that neutral category, disagree, and strongly disagree. Whenever you're using those like or ordinal response categories for your questions and statements, you want to make sure that you have an equal number of categories on both ends of the spectrum. So in that example I just gave you, there are two positive responses, strongly agree and agree, and two negative responses, disagree and strongly disagree. And then your fifth is in the middle. It is that neutral type of category. So I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. I'm willing to start work early or stay late to finish a job. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my current job. This is one of those reverse types of questions. In constructing our surveys, we oftentimes like to use a strategy known as a test retest type of strategy. So you'd ask the question one way, and then you would go and reverse that question. So this is one of those reverse questions. So if they are strongly agreeing that it's hard for them to get involved in their current job, that would be an indicator of a lack of motivation. I do extra work for my job that isn't really expected of me. And then the final one is another reverse one, very similar to what you saw on the job motivation scale. Time seems to drag while I am on the job. A third approach that's commonly used is the intrinsic motivation scale. And this is one that looks at the motivating effect of the work itself. When I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do a job well. Doing my job well increases my self-esteem. So we are looking at how motivated people are by the actual jobs that they are doing. Another approach looks at the rewards that people are getting from completing their tasks and how motivating those rewards are. So this is something that is done very commonly in the annual Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. Sometimes it used to go by the name the Federal Employee Engagement Survey, but it's a survey that's done every year by the Office of Personnel Management, measuring how engaged and motivated federal employees are. And I believe I've provided a link for that to that for you if you're interested in going and taking a look at that. You should know that 2025 was the final year for that survey. It had been done for decades, and that's its final year. The current administration has now taken it offline, has decided that they're not going to do it in the future. So unfortunately, we're probably not going to have that data moving forward. But it's an interesting survey because it really shows us just how motivated and engaged our federal employees are and some of the correlations between motivation and other types of variables. And just, I won't belabor it too much for you, but one of the important findings that we see every year from that survey is that there is a strong relationship between the size of the organization and the motivation and engagement level of employees. In that the smaller the organization, the more motivated and engaged our employees report themselves as. The larger the organization, the less motivated and engaged employees tend to be. So it's a very strong relationship. Another thing that comes out of that survey every year is that one of the lowest ranked indicators is expectancies, that people feel that they are not getting the rewards that they are entitled to get. And they oftentimes see other people who they feel are not doing as good of a job as they are doing, getting more rewards and better rewards than what they receive. And that's this reward expectancy type of approach. So producing a high quality of work increases my chances for higher pay. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for a promotion. So are they basically getting the expectancies, the rewards that they expect to get? Another approach, and we'll stop after this with these different approaches, but a peer evaluation of individual work motivation. So here is where we can evaluate our peers' work motivation. So you'll have fellow employees evaluate an individual's work motivation on things such as their team attitude, their concentration on the task, their ability to be a self-starter and work independently, their identification with the organization, their job curiosity, their persistence, their professional identification. But it allows us to not just extract the information from the individual employee, but to extract information from the peers of that individual employee. But again, it does become a little bit difficult whenever we are trying to uh, solicit this information directly from those individuals. But that essentially is the way in which we have to measure motivation through the use of these surveys. Again, there's that link there. We won't go to it now. That link to that annual survey that's done by the Office of Personnel Management, or had been done up until last year. But before we really get into a lot of these motivational theories, we also have to provide a caveat. And that caveat is that, yes, motivation is very important for productivity and performance levels. However, it alone does not determine performance. This is a great example of that old saying, it is necessary but not sufficient, because there are obviously other factors that can independently affect performance. The ability levels of that employee, the training of that employee, the preparation of that employee, and that employee's confidence, their perceptions in terms of their ability to get the job done. All of those things can also independently affect performance. So motivation alone is not good enough, but it is an important factor in explaining performance and productivity. So that disclaimer behind us, let's get into the primary motivational theories that we have seen over the past several years, and we can organize these theories into two broad categories. The first category of theories are our content-based theories, and the second category are our process-based theories. So content theories of motivation are primarily concerned with analyzing the needs, motives, and rewards that affect motivation. So we're really looking at the content of what motivates employees to exert that effort on a consistent basis. So the content of what motivates them. Then the second category are our process-based motivational theories. And these concentrate on the psychological and behavioral processes in motivation. Essentially, the process by which these motivators, these incentives are then distributed to employees. So the content of the motivators and the process in which those motivators are being provided. So in terms of our content-based motivational theories, we have four primary theorists that we look at in this class. Two of them we just finished talking about in the first half of class. Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, McGregor in his theory X and theory Y. And then we're going to add on Fred Herzberg in his two-factor theory, and then David McClellan and his needs-based model. So Abraham Maslow, we don't have to get into again because we just talked about it. The hierarchy of needs, that's the content of the motivators. We know that people are motivated by a deficiency in the deficiency needs, and they're motivated by a growth need with self-actualization. When we add on people like Chris Ardress, it then tells us we have to understand where our employees are on their personal growth development to understand which of these needs will be a content-based motivator, whether they're at the self-actualization level or if they're still at the deficiency level of needs. Again, with Douglas McGregor and his X and Y theories, as we know, we have some employees who are theory X. Those employees who are theory X are going to be motivated by those lower order needs in the Maslowian hierarchy of needs. Those employees who are more Y theory are going to be motivated by those higher order types of needs, such as self-actualization. Then we have Herzberg. And I don't know if you've been introduced to Herzberg yet in the program, but he is our third content-based motivational theorist. Herzberg tells us about his two-factor motivation theory. According to Herzberg, there are two factors. The first factor is motivating factor or motivators, and the second factor are hygiene factors. So, motivating factors are those intrinsic incentives, such as the interest that someone has in the work they're doing on a daily basis, their desire for achieving higher levels, their desire for having their higher order needs met. Those are what Herzberg considers to be motivators. So those intrinsic incentives are the ones that will motivate employees to exert effort on a consistent basis. However, the second factor, they're known as the hygiene factors. Hygiene factors are your extrinsic types of incentives. So things such as rewards like pay for performance, organizational conditions, such as having a comfortable, customary work environment. That would be an extrinsic type of incentive. That's what's considered to be a hygiene factor. Hygiene factors can only prevent dissatisfaction, but they will not lead to increased motivation. It's only those intrinsic incentives, those motivators, that will truly lead to higher levels of motivation. So, for instance, if someone has a clean workspace, that's a hygiene factor. That will help them from being dissatisfied, but it will not necessarily motivate them to exert more effort. You really need those intrinsic types of motivators, which really is good news for us in the public sector because that's all we really have oftentimes are these more intrinsic motivators. We don't have the pay for performance that our private sector counterparts have. So motivators, increase motivation, hygiene factors will not. And that's his two-factor motivational theory. Then we have McClellan. And McClellan is best known for his needs-based motivational models. According to McClellan, there are three different types of motivational needs. There's the achievement motivational need, where people are motivated by the desire to achieve more. There's the authority power motivator, which people are motivated by developing more power and more authority. And then there's the affiliation motivator, where people are motivated by their need for affiliation, to belong to a group or belong to an organization and to be accepted by others. That's kind of that psychological affiliation type of need. According to McClellan, of these three different types of needs, the one that is most commonly associated with public employees will be the achievement motivation. And he defines the achievement motivation as this dynamic restlessness to achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by one's own cunning, ability, and effort. So achievement is the ability to control your environment by using your own intuition and your cunning and your ability and your effort. That is this achievement type of motivator. And it's important that he also recognizes that it's a dynamic restlessness, which means that it doesn't end. You're always working toward that growth need. You're always working toward that achievement. And so it's this achievement motivator that is most commonly associated with your Y type of employee. The authority power motivator is more closely associated with people in leadership positions. People in leadership positions are oftentimes motivated to try and build up their power base. And so they're the ones who are going to be more motivated by authority power. And then people who are more at the lower level of the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, those are those individuals who will be more motivated by the need for affiliation. So those would be the people in the arduous personal growth trajectory that are at the earlier stages of that personal growth type of model. So in comparing those four content theories of motivation, they kind of relate to each other like this. Your first column, that's your Maslowian hierarchy of needs. So the bottom level of needs, your physiological, safety, love needs, and to a little bit lesser degree, your self-esteem needs, those are then related to McGregor's theory X. Those are then related to Herzberg's hygiene factors, which are related to McClelland's power and affiliation motivators. However, for your higher order Maslowian needs, such as self-actualization, that's going to be related to you being a theory Y employee. That's going to be related to those motivating, that first type of factor in Herzberg's typology. And that's also then going to be related to McClelland's achievement motivators. So our theory Y employees tend to be up there at the self-actualization and achievement type of level. Our lower level of employees tend to be more at the theory X, the hygiene factors, and much more along the lines of affiliation as what will motivate those employees. But again, these content-based motivating theories really look at the actual content of what motivates those employees. Are they motivated by the desire for achievement, the desire for affiliation, and so on and so on? But regardless of which of these content-based motivational theories you would ascribe to, if employees do not feel that they are being treated in an equitable manner by their organization, it will be impossible to motivate those employees. And that's what then leads us to this thing known as Adams' equity theory scale. In Adams' equity scale, Adams postulates a very simple postulate that employees provide inputs to the organization, and then they expect certain outputs to compensate them for those inputs. So these inputs are those contributions, those outputs are then those types of rewards. So examples of job inputs, contributions are things such as the job they are doing, the time they devote to that job, obviously the effort they put toward that job, their ability to be flexible, their commitment to the job and the organization, their level of honesty, their collegiality in terms of how they treat their colleagues, their heart, their integrity, their respect. Those are all things that individuals provide to their organizations in terms of inputs and contributions. The outputs that they expect in return, a paycheck, benefits, vacation time, recognition by the organization and others, responsibility, respect, a sense of purpose, a sense of achievement. Whenever the employee perceives a balance between inputs and outputs, then they are more willing to put forth that effort. The problem is obviously when there is an imbalance and when the inputs are outweighing the outputs. And when they feel that is happening, they'll feel they're not being treated equitably by the organization. And that's when it becomes hard to motivate them to exert efforts. The motivational school also tells us about organizational justice as kind of being one of these important prerequisites that we have before we can motivate our employees, regardless of what type of theory we use. So employees must feel that they are working in a just organization. And there are two types of justice that we tend to see in organizations. The first type of justice is distributive justice. Distributive justice looks at fairness and equity in the distribution of rewards. So we look at how the rewards and who is getting what in terms of these rewards. So do people think that who's getting what is a fair and equitable type of situation? In our annual survey of federal employees, we find out that the majority of federal employees do not feel that there's a lot of organizational justice in their organizations. They do not feel that there's a lot of distributive justice, in that they see other people who are not working as hard and not achieving as much as they are achieving, and feel those people are getting more rewards than what they are getting. So that's distributive justice, kind of who gets what. Then the second type of justice is procedural justice. And this is the fairness with which people feel employees are treating with processes and decision making. So here we're looking at the process that is used to distribute these types of rewards. And is the process fair? So distributive looks at who gets what from kind of a content perspective. Procedural justice looks more at the process by which those rewards are being handed out. Higher senses of distributive and procedural justice among employees will lead to higher levels of positive work-related attitudes. The more positive the work-related attitudes, the higher the levels of motivation. So people must feel that their organizations are just and are treating them in a fair and equitable manner. Then our second category of motivational theories are what are known as our process-based theories. And these may be for new people to you if you haven't taken psychology in the past, but Vroom, Skinner, Bandura, and Locke. So Vroom gives us what's called expectancy theory. B.F. Skinner gives us operant conditioning. Albert Bandura gives us social learning cognitive theory, and Locke provides us with what he calls goal setting theory. And these are all process-based theories of motivation. So let me walk you through each one of those four different process theories of motivation, what they are and how they work. The first one is from Vroom. And if you haven't dealt with Vroom before, Vroom is one of my favorite theories because it makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, and it's known as expectancy theory. The main claim in expectancy theory is that an individual employee, considering an outcome, will sum up all the values of the possible outcomes from a course of action and will then weight each of those outcomes by the probability of their occurrence. Essentially, what it means is when people are thinking about how much effort to exert, they will look at the outcomes and the rewards that they will receive from achieving what they want to achieve by putting forth this effort. And they will place value levels on all those different types of rewards. So if they value a reward enough, it will then motivate them to put forth the effort and motivate them to put forth the effort to accomplish a task. Essentially, Vroom's expectancy theory is predicated on this basic concept of utilitarianism. Individual employees are seen as rational, self-interested actors. All rational, self-interested actors are going to take actions and take steps to try and maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. They're going to try and maximize their pleasure while minimizing their pain. So, in expectancy theory, there are three main concepts that underpin expectancy theory. The first concept is valence. Valence refers to the value that people place on the rewards that they are going to receive. So, how important is additional pay or additional flexibility or a challenge to the individual employee? So, how much value do they place on these potential rewards? That's what's known as the valence level for each one of these rewards. The second concept is expectancy. Expectancy looks at the confidence that that employee has in their own capabilities. So how confident is that employee that if they put forth this amount of effort, this amount of effort will result in a certain level of performance? So if they're very confident that putting forth the effort will result in this performance, they're going to be more likely to put forth that effort. So it's their confidence in their own capabilities. And then the third concept is instrumentality. Instrumentality is the likelihood that the leader or manager will make good on their promises. So if an employee has been promised bonus pay for completing a project, what's the likelihood in the eyes of that employee that they will actually receive that bonus pay? And that's what's known as instrumentality. So in expectancy theory, managers must understand their individual employees' valence levels, how much they value rewards. They must understand the confidence levels of their individual employees in their own abilities. And they must also understand that leaders and managers must come through on their promises and that their employees believe that they're going to receive what they think they're going to receive. So what Vroom does for us is he gives us a formula. And now I don't think Vroom really believed that employees would walk around the workplace with a calculator and a pad of paper and a pencil calculating out their probabilities in their expectancy formula. But from a more general type of level, these are the types of things that employees will think about when they are deciding how much effort to exert. So what that formula tells us is the F in the formula stands for a function of. The dependent variable, what we are trying to predict here, is the amount of effort that an individual is going to put forth. So this is all a function of effort. The first term there in your parentheses, E to P, that E arrow P stands for the E is effort and the P is performance. So this is the likelihood that if an employee puts forth this amount of effort, that a certain performance level will occur. So in tangible types of sense, if an employee is coming in on a weekend to work on Saturday and Sunday to try and get a project done by Monday morning, what is the probability that coming in and working on Saturday and Sunday will get that project done by Monday morning? So what's the probability that that level of effort will lead to a level of performance? Are they 50-50 on whether or not they can get the job done by coming in on the weekend? Are they 80-20? Are they 20-80? So what is the percentage likelihood? Then your next term there, the P arrow O, stands for the probability that if they achieve this level of performance, that a certain type of outcome, a certain type of reward will accrue. So if I do get this project done by Monday morning, I have been promised that my manager will make me employee of the week. Well, how much confidence do I have that my manager will actually make me employee of the week if I get this project done by Monday morning? And then the V stands for the valence level. So how much value do I place on that reward of being declared to be employee of the week? So the amount of effort someone will put in is dependent upon their confidence that the effort will lead to a level of performance, their trust in their manager that a level of performance will lead to a reward, and then the value that they place upon that reward. And so essentially what expectancy theory means for managers in motivating employees is they need to understand the valence levels that employees place on different possible rewards, both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. They also have to understand the confidence that employees have in their own abilities to achieve that level of performance. And they also have to understand that performance means that managers must come through on their promises of giving these rewards to employees that meet those levels of performance. So again, essentially what we are doing in expectancy theory is we are using the amount of effort, the expected amount of effort, as our dependent variable. And so that's what we are trying to predict in our expectancy models. In public organizations, we do see expectancy theory in terms of a lot of that bonus pay and that pay for performance that did come out of the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. So, for example, you may remember from 500 in that Civil Service Reform Act, you had the creation of the Senior Executive Service. Those members of the Senior Executive Service, if their organizations achieved their goals or made progress toward their goals, achieved that performance level, then those SES members would then be given bonus pay. So in order to determine how much effort those SESers put toward achieving those goals, we would have to know how confident they are that their effort would result in achieving the goal. We would also have to understand the value they place on that bonus pay, and we would have to understand the confidence that they have that Congress would actually deliver on this promise of bonus pay. If you remember from the Civil Service Reform Act, what we found is that Congress broke its promise. And these SES members, senior executive service members, never received the bonus pay that they were promised. And so, because that promise was broken, that instrumentality was broken, we ended up with lower levels of motivation among those senior executive service members. So that's what's known as Vroom's expectancy theory, a process we can go through in order to determine how much effort employees are going to put forth to a certain type of activity. A second process-based motivational theory comes from the world of psychology. And I know we've talked a lot about psychology tonight, but here's another theory from psychology. It comes to us from B.F. Skinner. If you've taken any psychology classes, even like an intro Psych 101, you probably talked about B.F. Skinner and his theory of operant conditioning. Essentially, what B.F. Skinner says is that animals, and then by extension, people, will react in accordance with consequences. So whenever consequences occur, it will shape the behavior of those individuals. So people tend to repeat behaviors that they are rewarded for, and they will drop or extinguish behaviors that they are penalized for. And that's what's known as operant conditioning, the use of consequences to modify the occurrence in the form of behaviors. So what we are looking at here with operant conditioning is what types of consequences, positive or negative, we can provide to our employees to then motivate them to either continue an effective type of effort or to discontinue an ineffective effort. One of the things that Skinner found with his operant conditioning is that by far the most effective consequence is a positive one. So positive reinforcements are typically much more effective than negative reinforcements in terms of shaping the behavior of individuals. And to put a little bit more finer point on it, those positive reinforcements that are given in an intermittent schedule of reinforcement that are not necessarily done in predictable routines. It's those intermittent types of positive reinforcements that tend to have the greatest impact upon behavior acquisition. They tend to do what we call cement behaviors and make sure that people continue doing those behaviors time and time again. So this is a way to motivate people to continue engaging in positive behaviors and to continue exerting the effort that we would like to see them exert. Then a student of Skinner is Bandura. And Bandura took Skinner's operant conditioning theory and used it to build his own theory known as social learning or cognitive theory. In social learning cognitive theory, Bandura was not as concerned about consequences. He was much more concerned about the internal cognitive processes of individuals. He was interested in how people learn through their internal cognitive processes and how they change their behavior through this learning environment. And through this learning process, what they learn may not always be attached to these consequences, but people learn in a variety of different ways. According to Bandura's social learning cognitive theory, people can learn in a lot of ways other than just through this extra enforcement. People can learn through modeling the behavior of others. Throughout this program, you will probably talk about being a public leader means that you are taking on what's called an expository role. An expository role means that you are role modeling for others. You're role modeling proper behavior, not just for people in your organization, but also role modeling for members of the public. So if a leader or manager acts in an honest fashion and manages resources effectively and spends appropriations in the legally appropriated manner they're supposed to be spent on, and treats people well and with respect, those all signal to others that that's how they should behave as well. So people will learn through the role modeling of behaviors of others. And that's one way in which they go through these cognitive process to engage in social learning. A second way in which people engage in social learning is through vicarious experiences. So people don't always have to go through a negative experience to learn from it. They can see someone else going through a negative experience and learn from that. So they see a behavior of someone else resulting in some type of a penalty, and so therefore they are going to learn not to do that behavior. On the opposite side, they see a positive behavior that gets positive reinforcement, and they will vicariously live through that individual and learn through that experience. People also learn how to behave through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so I actually just got an email today from a student in the previous cohort who said that she did a presentation today, and which went really well. And she was crediting a lot of the opportunities she had to do presentations in this program with how well her presentation went. And so she had the opportunity to rehearse this presentation, to practice this presentation. You have the opportunity to imagine an effective presentation. All that mental rehearsal, practice, and imagery is another way in which we can learn positive types of behaviors. And then another way in which we can learn is through self-management, through the setting of goals. So individuals learn through establishing goals for themselves, and they learn what goals they want to achieve, and they learn how difficult or how simple achieving those goals are. So Bandura parts company from Skinner in that it's not just those external reinforcements and consequences that shape behavior and motivation, but it's really more about the learning process cognitively that people go through that shapes their behaviors and shapes their motivations. So again, very much of a process-oriented theory of motivations. And then our fourth process-oriented motivational theorist is Edwin Locke. Edwin Locke is best known for his goal-setting theory. According to Edwin Locke, if we can establish useful and difficult goals, those useful and difficult goals will lead to higher levels of motivation and in turn, higher levels of performance. Locke argues that goals focus behavior and motivate individuals to achieve their desired end states. So goals themselves can be motivating factors. We always have to have a commitment to those goals on the part of the organization and leadership, and we also have to have some feedback mechanism. So if people are not achieving their goals, they understand why those goals are not being achieved, and they can then make those changes and rectify their behavior to help better achieve those goals in the future. As the value of a goal increases, the person's commitment to achieving that goal increases as well. So goals affect behavior and affect motivation by directing employee attention on certain types of activities. Goals can intensify the effort of employees, thus leading to higher levels of motivation. Goals can also intensify the persistence of employees in the activities they're doing to try and continue working toward the achievement of those goals. And goals can also spark creativity on the part of our employees in terms of problem solving. Goals really do help to provide this sense of purpose and help us create standards for evaluating the performance of our employees. And so everyone knows what employees are working toward, and every employee knows what they're exerting their effort toward, and that is achieving these goals. We know that goals tend to work best with the support of leadership and management. We also know that the greater the success, the greater the employee satisfaction. But there is a paradox here. And the paradox is that more difficult goals are oftentimes less likely to be achieved. They're more difficult to achieve. And the lack of that achievement will then leave our employees unsatisfied. Being unsatisfied then fosters ambition, which then will push people harder to strive to achieve the goal in the future. So it actually pushes people to be motivated to exert more effort to work harder to try and erase that dissatisfaction with not achieving the goal. There is a theory in public administration that we have borrowed from the world of physics, and it's what's called field theory. And we have borrowed liberally from field theory. But essentially, with field theory, what we are saying is that when people have unaccomplished tasks, there is kind of this force field of all these forces that are influencing individuals. And whenever people have an unaccomplished task, it creates this force of tension. That only way that people can relieve that tension is by accomplishing that task or accomplishing that goal. So, unachieved goals can be motivators in and of themselves and make people work harder and exert more effort to try and achieve that goal. Mixed methodology types of goals are also useful for motivation, mixing both qualitative as well as quantitative indicators into this type of mixed methodology. Having those kind of nuanced and complex and difficult to achieve goals can be helpful. And assigning proper responsibility for who is accountable for the achievement of these goals. So we know who is accountable for what. It's important that we empower employees to have some flexibility and latitude in developing strategies for achieving these goals that will help motivate those employees. We need effective leadership when we establish these goals, which is kind of something we know in strategic planning. We need to have that feedback loop so we know if we're not achieving those goals, why we're not achieving those goals, and how to go back and rectify that situation. We need to have commitment to goals. Managers should stress that the goals are important and have personal value to those individual employees and how to then attain those goals. And this is a big one for most organizations with goal setting. Beware of goal overload. If, as an organization, you establish too many goals, then you run the risk of those goals coming into conflict with each other, and then employees don't know how and which goals to then pursue. And that will have a depressing impact upon their motivational levels. So try and keep the goals a limited number, make them very clear goals, and make sure that you have buy-in in achieving those goals among employees as well as leaders and managers. But this whole theory is just premised on the idea that another process for motivating employees is through establishing important and meaningful goals for those employees to work toward. So those are 4 process-based motivational theories. One thing that you will see when you look at those content-based and process-based motivational theories is that, like with human resource management theory, there is no one conclusive answer. No one theory alone has provided a conclusive explanation for motivation. Motivation is very contextual in nature, which makes motivational theory one of our more modern theories, moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach. Because of that, researchers in the School of Motivation Theory have come to an agreement that the literature itself is kind of in a disorderly state. Because the search for universal theories is fruitless, what we need to do is develop separate and distinct theories to apply in different types of settings. This is oftentimes what we refer to as middle range theories. A middle range theory is a theory that will apply in a specific situation, but may not apply universally across the board in every single organization. So what the literature has tried to do is to create taxonomies, motivational types that work effectively in different types of situations. So in this type of context, this is a motivational strategy that tends to work well. So if you're in the context where you have employees who tend to be what Anthony Downs would call your climbers. Climbers are your younger employees who are looking to advance up the organizational chart in the organization. Those people are going to be motivated by the opportunity to advance into superordinate positions. And so offering those types of advancement opportunities will be effective motivators in that type of a setting. However, if you are in a setting where you have what Anthony Downs would call conservers, your more, I won't say older, I'll say more veteran employees who have been in the organization for a while. They have already acquired the perks of the office, and they're motivated by trying to conserve those perks. They're motivated by trying to conserve what they have already accumulated throughout their careers. So they're going to be motivated by being able to keep what they currently have and not losing what they currently have. So those are different ways that you would motivate depending upon those two different settings. So even though the motivational literature is somewhat disjointed, it is still useful for helping us understand all these different complexities that we encounter in terms of motivating our employees. But motivation, as we said at the outset of this discussion of motivational theory, motivation is difficult in public organizations because we tend to be very limited in that we oftentimes do not have the ability to utilize these extrinsic rewards such as pay for performance because that will be precluded with our position classification systems and our civil service system. Now, even though overall pay for performance has not worked that well in public organizations, there are some glimmers in some organizations where it has been effective. So again, you're back to that development of taxonomies. So in certain settings, for some organizations, limited extrinsic incentives work well, but for the vast majority of our organizations, we focus much more on those intrinsic types of incentives. In terms of those types of intrinsic incentives, since we are limited to only intrinsic incentives oftentimes in the public sector, there is this assumption that public sector employees tend to be less motivated than their private sector counterparts. However, there's been a lot of research that has been done looking at the motivation of public employees. And if you're interested in that literature, we won't get into it tonight, but one of those authors is author by the name of James Perry, Perry, James Perry. Let me put that in text chat, James Perry. Another author that has done a lot of work in these intrinsic motivators in the public sector is a man by the name of Ed Kellogg. And Ed Kellogg, he went through the same doctoral program I did. He came through the doctoral program 2 people before I did. And so all I heard from my dissertation chair was Ed Kellogg did this and Ed Kellogg did that. So I kind of got tired of hearing Ed Kellogg. But he's done a lot of great work looking at the impact of intrinsic incentives on the motivational level of public employees. But throughout that research, the common theme that we have seen is that there are not statistically significant differences between the sectors in terms of employees' self-reported motivation. For the most part, public employees do tend to maintain relatively high levels of self-reported motivation. And if you have time to take a look at that annual survey that I've mentioned a couple of times in this class done by OPM, you'll see that those motivational and engagement levels are relatively high, even for very large organizations. So very large organizations, the engagement and motivational levels will be in the 75 to 80% level in terms of responses from federal employees. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that public employees are not motivated. There's no real statistically significant difference between sectors in terms of motivation. So we are, as we said, much more limited in terms of only being able to use intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic motivators. But we've had some authors who have kind of looked at incentives that are used for motivation and broken them up into specific types of categories. Chester Barnard, who we talked about earlier tonight and we'll talk about again next week, When he looks at incentives, says that there are two main categories of incentives organizations can use to motivate their employees. The one category are worker specific incentives. The second category are non-worker specific incentives. So, very simply, a worker specific incentive will be material incentives such as pay for performance, non-material incentives such as recognition as Employee of the Week, work conditions. Those are all worker specific. Non-specific incentives are going to be more organizational in nature. And so the freedom from hostility, comfortable customary work practices, those are not worker specific. And so those are the two categories that Barnard tends to use for talking about these types of incentives. Herbert Simon, who we've talked about previously, we talked about on Monday, he was one of those major critics of the principal school of organization theory. Herbert Simon says that he also has two different categories of incentives, but his categories are employee-based incentives and employer-based incentives. So Simon says, pun intended, that employee-based incentives are things such as money, pay for performance, prestige, social recognition, promotional opportunities. However, the incentives that will appeal to motivation for employers, again, you're with power and authority. Very similar to what David McClellan told us in his needs-based motivational theories. Another author who contributes to our understanding of the role that incentives play in motivation is someone who I've already mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and that is Anthony Downs. Anthony Downs argues that the types of incentives you want to use will depend upon the type of employee that you are dealing with. And these are what he refers to as his bureau ideologies. He identifies for us 5 different types of employees we typically see in public organizations. And these 5 different types of employees will be motivated differently by different types of incentives. So as I mentioned before, the first type of employee is a climber. A climber is a younger employee who is very focused on promotional opportunities. So promotional opportunities will appeal as a motivator for those employees. If the path to promotions is blocked for these climbers, Downs says these climbers will then engage in what he calls jumping. And that's when they jump to another organization that will provide them with those promotional opportunities. As we said before, the second type of employee is a conserver. These are your more veteran employees, the ones who have been in the organization a while. They are motivated by trying to keep what they have already acquired, hence the reason why they're called conservers. Third type of employee is a zealot. A zealot, according to Downs, is an employee who is a very strong believer in a specific issue or a specific cause. So that person will be motivated if they see that exerting the effort will help them achieve that specific issue or achieve that specific cause. But they are zealots focused on achieving one specific type of cause. And that's how they are motivated. Fourth category are called advocates. Advocates are those employees who are basically, they feel very closely aligned to their unit, their division, their department. So they are serving as advocates for their department. So to motivate those types of advocates, you can motivate them with additional appropriations or additional resources being provided to their department to help their departments grow, because they are advocates for their departments. And then your fifth type of employee is what Downs referred to as statesmen. And it's statesmen because you can see it was written back in 1967. But these statesmen are these employees who put public service above all else. They put service to society above service to themselves. So they are motivated by seeing the relationship between what they do on a daily basis and how it helps their community and how it helps society as a whole. So the utility of Downs is that if we know what type of bureau ideology we are dealing with, we will know what type of motivator to use to get those employees to exert the type of effort that is needed for accomplishing our goals. And then finally, to harken back to this individual I mentioned before, James Perry. James Perry did a lot of research into what motivates public employees, what motivates public servants. And he put together a questionnaire to help him answer that question. And in this research, he came up with 4 different measures of public service motivation. The first measure of public service motivation he called attraction to public affairs. Attraction to public affairs means how much someone is obviously attracted to doing work in the public sector. So he used questionnaire items such as a statement like politics is a dirty word. That's a reverse one because if people agree politics is a dirty word, then it's going to be score lower on that motivation to work in a political environment such as in the public service. The give and take of public policy making doesn't appeal to me. Again, a reverse one. And I don't care much for politicians. Now, I don't know if this is a great questionnaire item because I know a lot of public servants who don't care much for politicians either. But this was kind of his way of measuring how attracted people are to working in the public sector and working in public affairs. Did it evolve over time? It did. I think that Downs certainly recognized as he went through his career, it's more, statespeople than it is really statesmen. It's just the terminology is kind of just an artifact of the time in which it was written in the 1960s. Commitment to public interest. This is your second type of dimension of measure of public service motivation. It is hard to get me generally interested in what's going on in my community. That's another reverse one because if people don't care what's going on in their community, they're probably not very committed to public interest. I unselfishly contribute to my community. That would be a commitment to public interest. Meaningful public service is very important to me. Yet another indicator of commitment to public interest. I would prefer seeing public officials do what is best for the community, even if it harmed my interests. I consider public service as a civic duty. Then the third dimension is compassion, because that's something we certainly need working as public administrators. A reverse type of statement, I'm rarely moved by the plight of the underprivileged. Most social programs are too vital to do without. It is difficult for me to contain my feelings when I see people in distress. To me, patriotism includes seeing to the welfare of others, and so on and so on. We don't have to go through them all, but that gives you an idea of how he would then measure this third dimension of public service motivation as compassion. And then the fourth one is self-sacrifice. Making a difference in society means more to me than personal achievement. I believe in putting duty before self. Doing well financially is definitely more important to me than doing good deeds. That's another reverse one. Much of what I do is for a cause bigger than myself. Serving citizens would give me a good feeling, even if no one paid me for it, and so on and so on. So essentially what Perry is telling us is that people who work in the public service are attracted to the public service. They are more motivated by intrinsic types of motivators, which again is good news for us because we are limited in our ability to use extrinsic motivators in the public service. I think this is a strong explanation for why motivational levels are nearly as high in the public sector as they are in the private sector, even in the absence of things like pay for performance. On an anecdotal type of basis, I see this every day, or at least when I was department chair, I saw this every day when I reviewed applications to our stateside program. And when I read those statements of intent, and same thing with the DLMPA program, in all those statements, I saw this public service motivation coming through loud and clear. That people were doing this not necessarily for making money or getting great benefits. They were doing this for what they could give back to society and their community. And so motivating people in the public sector is much more oriented around intrinsic as compared to extrinsic types of incentives. So I kind of hope that you can see why we talk about motivational theory here tonight, building off of human resource management theory, because with motivational theory, we have come to the realization that in order to motivate people to put forth the effort to benefit the organization and to benefit themselves and their own development, we have to understand the differences between our employees. Employees are not all the same. They have different ideologies. They are motivated by different types of incentives. And we have to understand those differences, which means we can never have that universal one size fits all organization theory like the classical theorists try to tell us. Today, when we study not just motivation, but we study our public organizations in general, we have to take a much more nuanced and a much more complex approach to studying those organizations by studying their settings, their context, and their unique cultures and their unique characteristics. That is a theme that we're going to pick up on in a future class session when we talk about more modern theories such as organization culture and how every organization has its own culture, its own set of norms and values and expectations. And unless we understand that unique culture, we'll never be able to study and understand that unique public organization. Well, I think I have talked for more than enough tonight. That's about 3 hours of listening to me drone on and on about neoclassical theories and motivational theories. I will ask you at this point, do you have any questions or need any clarifications either on human relations, human resource management, or motivational schools of thought? Hopefully this kind of makes sense to you. Admittedly, there is a lot of information here. I know that. And a lot of this information we covered in the second half of class tonight, you're not going to find in the Tompkins textbook. But the good news is that one of the goals of this class is to help prepare you for your organization theory case study when you get to PPA 697. It may seem like it's way off in the distance, but I think your first section of 697 is coming around next spring, late spring, early summer. So this, of course, is supposed to help you prepare for that organization theory case study. The good news for you is I will be grading that organization theory case study. The bad news is I oftentimes don't develop that case study. That case study is usually developed by Dr. Baber. He is in his last year of FERPing, which is the Faculty Early Retirement Program, which means one of his last things he'll do going out the door is to prepare the case study for organization theory that you will be doing in 697. However, what you are looking for in terms of this case study is being able to look at the situation that's provided to you in the case and then applying some of the theorists that we cover in this class to analyzing that case study. Now, in applying those theories, the ones that will be most important for the application will be your classical theorists, your HR theorists, your human resource management theorists, the systems theorists that we're going to talk about next week. Those are going to be the theorists that you want to have a working knowledge of that you can then take and apply to the case study. Let's see, what is it? The portion of human resource management training that requires individuals to sign a training bond feels different from what we have seen today. Can you elaborate? A lot of organizations, when they do provide training for their employees, they do want to make sure that that training is going to benefit the organization. I know that in previous years, when I had students in the program that were on a tuition reimbursement program with their employer, that employers required that the employee remain in the organization for a certain number of years after they completed their degree. I don't see that used very often anymore. I know that there have been some court challenges over that. So today, a lot of organizations are not requiring people to remain in their organizations. The private sector, we are seeing that still frequently used. because they're able to do that more readily in the private as compared to the public sector. And so some private corporations, if they are going to pay for you to go and get your degree or get a certain type of training, they are going to require that you commit to stay in the organization for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. So that tends to happen a little bit more frequently in the private sector than it does today in the public sector. But back in the day when we were using work sites in the DL-MPA program, it was very, very common for organizations to say, we'll reimburse your tuition and your books, but you got to make a commitment to us to stay in the organization for a certain number of years. When an organization does that, they're taking a much more human relations approach as compared to a human resource management approach. Now, I think the more human resource management approach that a lot of organizations are taking today, that's not being done primarily for altruistic reasons. I think it's being done because they've been told they cannot require people to stay in their organizations, and it's been done for competitive purposes in terms of competing for labor sources with other public organizations. So it may not all be altruistic, but you see it less often in the public sector than you see in a lot of private organizations and corporations. Are there any other observations, any other comments about any or questions about any of this information that we have covered in our two-part class this evening, either HR, HRM, or motivational theories? What I will do is make sure that we get this recording up on the Canvas site sometime tomorrow. I have been using beach captions in order to do it. I ran into a couple problems with beach captions yesterday for the class that I taught yesterday for stateside. So I just used my normal approach with YouTube. I'm going to try beach captions again for this recording. Hopefully it will work. If it doesn't work, then I'll make sure to get the YouTube link up there by tomorrow, probably by about 1 or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So you can go through and review this information. As you review this information, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Happy to clarify any of those questions for you. Also, one last reminder, make sure that you get your 3 posts for Canvas essay number 2 done no later than midnight on Monday, the 22nd. Then we'll be back together next Wednesday as a class. We'll start off with a discussion of systems theory, both closed as well as open systems. We'll also talk about Robert Merton and how he kind of served as a bridge between closed and open systems thinking. We'll do a breakout room exercise. Since we didn't get to do one tonight, we'll do one next Wednesday. And if we have time remaining in the second part of class next Wednesday, then we'll probably move into some of our other more modern organization theories just to kind of try and clear the decks a little bit, so that on our second Monday session, which will be on the 29th, we'll be able to wrap up all that information in terms of all of our schools of thought, and then also have some time for anyone who would like to volunteer to do their organizational analysis presentation on that Monday, June the 29th. If anyone is interested in doing your presentation on the 29th, you're going to be here in that class on that Monday, please send me an email, let me know, and I'll put together a schedule. If we could maybe get 4 or 5 people at minimum to do their presentations on the 29th, then we get together in our final Wednesday session. We then should have ample time to get through all the remaining presentations. Remember, these presentations are very informal. They're very brief, 5 to 10 minutes, leaning more toward 5 as opposed to 10 minutes. 10 minutes is kind of that hard cap. And so if I'll be timing them, if you hit 10 minutes, we'll have to stop the presentation at that point in time so we can make sure that we have everybody with ample time to get through the presentations, because we have 28 people who need to do presentations between the 29th and then our last Wednesday session. So if you want to be a volunteer for that Monday session, please send me an email. Okay. All right. I will let you go. We've been at for over 3 hours. I think that's plenty of time. Have a great remainder of your week. Any questions, reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you back in Zoom next Wednesday evening. Take care and have a great week.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Professor, can I talk to you for just a minute after class, actually?
Sure. Let me shut down our recording. There we go.